Hi, everyone. After this fantastic session, it is not easy to follow, but I wish the speakers good luck. So now we have a conversation about WSIS+20, the World Summit on the Information Society. I assume that a lot of you are familiar with this term. This is a process which many in the internet governance community have been involved in since 2003, 2005, and we're currently undergoing the 20-year review. Actually, one of my colleagues, Paul Blaker, is currently in New York, and he's going to be joining us online, reporting live from the informal negotiations next week. That review will conclude, and you will learn a lot about what WSIS is, if you haven't heard about it yet, and you will learn about what is at stake. I welcome David Souter to the stage, who is an expert on the digital society and has been an integral part to what WSIS is today. And we have the pleasure of having Nick Wenban-Smith, who is the General Counsel and Head of Stakeholder Relations at Nominet, join us as well. And Ellie McDonald, who is the Policy and Advocacy Lead at Global Partners Digital, who will be discussing this alongside Paul Blaker, the Head of ITU and Internet Governance at the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. Please give them a warm round of applause.
Okay, so my name is David Souter. I'm going to give a brief introduction to WSIS+20, so what it is, how it's been negotiated, who the actors are in the room, and what are the main issues involved. And I'll begin with basics, which I know some people here will be very familiar with, but others won't. So please bear with me if you are particularly familiar. If you're not, some of what I'm going to say may seem arcane, but I think it's important to understand the process of what's going on before I describe the issues that are being discussed. So the World Summit on the Information Society, WSIS for short, was a global summit held in two sessions in 2003 and 2005. And it established the framework for international cooperation on digitalization, which has lasted since that time, especially in the United Nations. And like all global summits, the outcomes were heavily contested during the negotiations 20 years ago, but they become a kind of gospel truth since then. And there were two main phases. The Geneva phase in 2003 was concerned with development issues, and it set out a structure for international cooperation. And the Tunis phase in 2005 dealt with a couple of issues on which agreement wasn't reached in Geneva, which were financing and internet governance. Among other things, it established the IGF. But bear in mind, please, that WSIS is not primarily concerned with the internet or internet governance. It's primarily about information technology and development. So the internet may be a major issue for the internet community, but it's only about 1/6 or less of the text of the agreements, and it's not the priority for developing countries in this negotiation. So the summit outcomes were debated and updated by the UN General Assembly in 2015 after 10 years, and we're going through a similar updating process now after 20. And the negotiations have been going on for several months. Next week, the General Assembly holds a 2-day debate that will agree the final text, or at least we hope it will. And what's my involvement? I've been involved with WSIS since before it actually began, but I've written the United Nations Secretary General's reviews of WSIS outcomes for many years. And I wrote the background paper for the 10-year review, and early this year I wrote the background paper for the 20-year review, which you can find online. It's a book-length text, so it will take you a while to read it, if you wish to. For the last few months, I've been the lead advisor for the negotiations that are ending next week. So I've been working with the co-facilitators. They're the two ambassadors to the General Assembly who have been steering the negotiations, working with them to draft a resolution that sets out what's happened since WSIS, what new things might be agreed, to consider the proposals made by governments and other stakeholders for a text that could secure the consent, ideally, of every government when the General Assembly meets next week. So I'll explain a little about how the process works, because I think that's often misunderstood. We started in July with what's called an elements paper, and that set out the issues that would be covered. And there were multi-stakeholder consultations on that, after which we issued what's called a zero draft, which is a preliminary text of what could be in a final resolution, but is intended not as a final text, but as not even as a draft really, but to encourage comments and suggestions from governments and other stakeholders. So that zero draft had around 10,000 words in 145 paragraphs. And to illustrate the challenge that we then have, we had around 4,000 text suggestions and more than 160 proposed additional paragraphs from governments alone, and about the same again from other stakeholders. So we analysed those and prepared a revised resolution called Rev 1, And that's where the intergovernmental negotiations began last month. Now, these are line-by-line negotiations on the draft between government delegations. We had 15 hours of those last month, and as a result of that, we prepared Rev 2, which responded to what was said in those first negotiations. And there have been another 12 hours of discussion on that this week in New York, which resulted last night in the preparation of a further revision. If I look a bit bleary-eyed, I was up till 3:30 in the morning discussing with the co-facilitators the content of this latest resolution draft. That's being discussed today in New York, and it is hoped that towards the end of the week or at the beginning of next week, we can move towards what's called a silence procedure, where a text is available and is assumed to have consent from governments unless they specifically raise an objection to it. So that would go to the General Assembly next week and hopefully to agreement. So I think it's important to understand three things about this process in practice. First, about the actors in the room. So there are two main groups. There's what's called the Group of 77 developing countries, which is actually 134 countries these days. And that's 2/3 of the General Assembly's membership. And it negotiates as a bloc in conjunction with China, though China's played very little part in these negotiations. And the EU is the other main group in the negotiations, but other countries in the global north also make their voices heard, including the UK, Australia, Canada, Switzerland, Japan. Much of the negotiation is really between these two blocs, so say developing countries in the G77 and developed countries in the OECD. The United States and the Russian Federation also have distinct voices, especially this year. And the goal is to reach a text which works well enough for every government to secure adoption in the General Assembly. People sometimes call this a consensus, but I think that implies a higher level of agreement than is necessary or even possible. A lot of what's achieved is compromise, and sometimes that has to be sufficiently ambiguous to be interpreted in different ways by different governments and different stakeholders. So what's going on at present this week in New York is essentially a bargaining process, much of it between the global south and global north. And what comes out of that involves trade-offs. Each side will make concessions, some of which will be rhetorical, some of which will be substantive. Different parties have their different red lines. The EU, the G77, the United States, Russia in particular will have their red lines. So nobody should expect to get everything they want out of this process. And the role of the co-facilitators here is not to put forward what they themselves think or what their countries think or what individual delegations might think. Their role is to put forward something which they believe can get the assent of the General Assembly at the end of the day, including its very diverse representation of different governments. Not what is ideal, but in anyone's particular view, but what is feasible. The other point I'd make is that it's much more difficult to achieve this than it was 20 years ago, because the issues now are more complicated, because global politics is more polarized, and because the assumptions that underpin the rules-based international order are much weaker than they were. I'll turn to the issues that are currently in play. There are significant parts of the draft resolution on which there's a fair degree of agreement, and maybe even consensus, particularly where these are really essentially descriptive or rhetorical. So, for example, the need to address digital divides or identify ways of advancing social and economic development, the importance of capacity building, the need for better monitoring and measurement. There's more disagreement on other areas, such as trust and security, artificial intelligence, and the environment, which partly derive from the emphasis that different governments and stakeholders put on them. There's significantly more disagreement on how to turn rhetoric into substantive action. So the G77 is primarily concerned with development outcomes. What are the opportunities and risks for developing countries from new technologies? How can the opportunities be realized with more equitable outcomes? For example, the G77 wants to see substantive initiatives, including new initiatives that will address digital divides, and sees those divides not just in terms of connectivity and usage, but also in terms of new technology, including artificial intelligence. It wants to see commitments to capacity building and technology transfer, and it would like to establish financial mechanisms that will address investment deficits in developing country infrastructure. It's also made proposals for new initiatives concerning AI in developing countries. And the G77 is also concerned about governance. The perception that decisions that affect developing countries are made by governments and corporations in the global north primarily, and that this needs to be addressed. So one area in which that's been prominent concerns the concept of enhanced cooperation, which is one of the ambiguous terms I mentioned earlier that was introduced to get agreement in 2005, but has caused endless problems of interpretation since then. It was introduced, I might say, by a British civil servant in 2005. The co-facilitators have been seeking to find language that can move this forward rather than reinvigorating previous arguments which have been very difficult to resolve. The EU and other OECD countries have focused on different priorities, seeking to extend language on human rights, to maximize the openness of legal and regulatory frameworks, to maintain the multi-stakeholder principles that have evolved within the WSIS framework, and to support other aspects of the settlement on internet governance that was one of the major achievements of the Tunis Agenda in 2005. So this includes the global IGF, whose mandate has to be renewed in this review. There have been proposals made within the process to make the mandate permanent, also for more stable funding and for improvements in the working modalities of the global IGF and indeed its relationship with national IGF such as this. So the sections on financial mechanisms, human rights and internet governance, they're among those that have been intensively discussed and are still intensively discussed this week. I'd add quickly two further issues. So one concerns the Global Digital Compact, which is the GDC, which is a separate UN agreement that was negotiated last year and is particularly concerned with AI and data governance. So most governments agree that the compact and the WSIS framework need to be closely aligned or integrated or converged or coherent with one another. And the co-facilitators' approach for this has been for the WSIS text to reaffirm the compact. But what institutional arrangements that requires in practice is not yet clear, and it is a subject of discussion. And there are a few countries that don't accept the legitimacy of the GDC, including one major country. The US government also has its own agenda. It no longer endorses the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which is the UN's core statement of a core framework for development and with which WSIS is aligned. And it also wants to alter references to gender equality, inclusion and diversity. So those are some of the issues that are being raised in the negotiation at the moment. That's my attempt to summarize. I hope it's been reasonably clear. Negotiations are starting again in New York in about 3/4 of an hour. You'd appreciate, because of my role in the negotiating process, I can't give a personal view or any details of what might be said within the negotiations that are currently underway, but I hope that's been useful generally.
Thank you very much, David. We are genuinely very privileged to have the literal world expert on this topic in here to tell us all about it. So very grateful. Thank you. Up to you. There isn't a chair here, so I guess take a seat down. I think we'll come back to David if we get a chance later. Now we're going to go straight to New York City, where we are going to hear hopefully from Paul Blaker, who is part of the UK government's delegation at the negotiating table, to get the latest update as of now. Paul, if you can hear us.
First of all, thanks for the opportunity to speak. And so I'm in the UN building. My name is Paul Blaker. I am head of ITU and Internet Governance in the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, and I've been leading the UK negotiators here in New York and throughout the process. I think just, first of all, just worth reminding ourselves, why is this important? I think it's important because it sets a global agenda. It's not binding, but in many countries, and especially developing countries, the WSIS action lines and the outputs of different WSIS processes are a really important guide for their national approaches. They do have a lot of weight and a lot of influence. And WSIS also steers the work of a whole range of UN agencies. It sets a direction for global conversation about some big issues such as the management of the internet, cybersecurity, digital development and inclusion. And this 10-year review is quite a major milestone. I think at the outset, from the UK government point of view, we were aware of some major risks in this process. There are still countries who think that the internet should be managed by an intergovernmental organisation like the ITU, for example. And they could have used this review to try to achieve that end. We think that would have been really damaging to the development and growth of the internet, the decisions taken for political reasons and negotiated between governments. And that was certainly a big discussion 10 years ago at the WSIS+10 review. But we've been really pleased to see that view has not had so much influence on the process this time. And I do think that the current multi-stakeholder model of internet governance has become a more settled consensus with day-to-day management of the internet led by the private sector and other stakeholders, including the technical community, governments and civil society, all having a role to say in how the internet is run. So the UK went into this review with a very positive agenda. We wanted to make sure that the WSIS process was looking to the future and to new challenges that we face. And we emphasised issues such as the environmental impact of digital technology, the need to promote inclusion, for example, in terms of gender or disability, to ensure human rights remain central to the WSIS process, and particularly to look at the urgent needs to connect the unconnected when 1/3 of the world's population still don't have access to the internet, and looking to find new and innovative approaches to encourage investment and use development aid most effectively and sustainably. Finally, of course, we've emphasised the need to ensure that the multi-stakeholder model is not only maintained, but it's more globally inclusive, and that developing countries and stakeholders from developing countries are able to participate meaningfully. And we have 2 days of negotiations left, and they're about to start again in about 45 minutes. And there's a saying in internet, in intergovernmental negotiations, that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. A lot could happen over the next 2 days. But I think we do have a clear idea now of what the outcome will look like. And there are likely to be some significant changes to the WSIS. So it's likely we'll have some kind of task force or group looking at funding mechanisms. Not the kind of big top-down funds that have failed in the past, but looking at some examples of what works, some of the new innovative approaches to financing the development, and making sure that that funding is really having a sustainable long-term and more holistic impact. There are likely to be new roadmaps for the WSIS action lines, which means UN agencies will have to set out the development challenges, what will be done to address them, with clear outcomes and clear indicators. It's hard to believe we didn't have those until now, but I think asking UN agencies to produce these will change the nature of WSIS towards a much more practical and outcome-based process. There's likely to be a new role for the UN Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights and for UN Women, something we strongly welcome. There's a whole new section in the draft at the moment on environmental impacts. This is something that wasn't really addressed back in 2005, and we're really pleased to see it being properly addressed now. There's new language on gender-based violence and tackling that, and on misinformation. At the moment, in the draft, there's a section on AI. A lot of discussions going on around that at the moment. Up until now, WSIS has always been technology neutral, and it focused on the challenges and opportunities of technology rather than particular kinds of technology. I think we've all recognised that AI is different, and we do need to address it specifically, but that issue has not been resolved yet. I think that the new document will have a lot more emphasis on digital economy and opportunities for businesses. And finally, there's a lot of new text on the role of the IGF, and we are really pleased to see recognition of local and regional IGFs, like the UK IGF, in the draft document. I think that's really important for local IGFs, particularly in parts of the world where it's difficult for stakeholders to find a common platform to engage with governments. So recognising that in that General Assembly document gives them a lot more weight and should be very helpful. And there's also a request for the IGF to report to other parts of the UN system, which I think will give it greater influence and give the IGF greater impact as a multi-stakeholder platform within the UN family. So there are lots of new things. I think WSIS will start to look and feel a bit different over future years. I'll just say finally on the process, I think from the outset, we wanted to make sure that as much as possible there was meaningful engagement by stakeholders throughout the process. Not just a few consultation meetings at the start, but a sustained collaboration with stakeholders right through to the end of the process. And we've been really pleased at the commitments the co-facilitators and the UN Secretariat have demonstrated. We've had some great contributions from stakeholders which have really kept the process grounded in reality, in real experience, and maybe helped to keep some of the UN politics at bay. I think we recognise it takes an awful lot of time and commitment from stakeholders to input into these intergovernmental processes. It's not easy to contribute to processes at the UN if you're not a government. And I have to pay tribute to all the stakeholders that have been involved, particularly Global Partners Digital, who did an awful lot to help make sure civil society had a strong voice, and pay tribute to the role of Nominet in helping to establish the technical community coalition for multi-stakeholderism. Because I think both of those organisations have made really valuable contributions which have been heard by the governments. So to end, we have got 2 days to go. I think we are cautiously optimistic, but we do have an opportunity to make sure this is as effective and future-facing and outcome-focused as it can be. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. And if I look more relaxed now, it's because Paul had a very narrow window between getting up and having to go to the UN to actually participate in these things. So I'm very pleased that we were running slightly late and now we've come back full circle. We're very grateful for that insight. And I think as part of the UK stakeholder community, from what I've seen over many years, is just how exemplary the British government has been about including the non-governmental civil society and industry representatives. So on behalf of all of us, a big thank you. To continue the discussion, nice segue over to Global Partners Digital, who complete the triangle between the technical, the governmental and the civil society participants.
This has been incredibly insightful for me as well, because both David and Paul have been in the room and been part of these intergovernmental negotiations, and we have not. So if I may, I will take us just a little bit backwards, and I'd like to talk a little bit about why we at Global Partners Digital and why the broader community felt it was important to do the work and invest in this process. And here I'm talking particularly about the preparatory process that preceded these closed-door intergovernmental negotiations that we're hearing about. And so GPD, we're a human rights organisation, and like many others, we wish to engage in this review because we were aware of the outcomes that you've already heard about from David and Paul, both questions of the WSIS action lines and that framework, its kind of durability, its continuation, how to adapt it for the future. Of course, the question of the mandate renewal of the Internet Governance Forum. And importantly for us, we were aware that all of this was taking place at a moment of jeopardy, to be honest, where relatively stable norms around, for instance, inclusive development were being contested by actors like the US. Also a moment where the very ability of the multilateral system to deliver on the agenda was being questioned. And so we thought it was incredibly important to engage. But I want to say that we didn't just see the threat, we also saw it as a moment of opportunity. And you're an incredibly well-informed audience. And so you'll know, I think, a lot about the history of WSIS and the kind of near universal government acceptance it achieved of the multi-stakeholder model of internet governance, multi-stakeholder approach. But I think it also has a real history of experimentation and relative innovation within the UN system. So it's a space where non-governmental stakeholders have inputted to shape the WSIS action line framework itself, the WSIS outcomes. And so we saw the potential of the WSIS as a process where we could further innovate and shape the way that digital policy making actually happens at the UN. And GPD, we put together with a group of human rights organisations, the Global Digital Rights Coalition for WSIS. And that was a civil society grouping that coalesced around 3 main goals. So the first was to anchor the WSIS action lines, framework's future development and the WSIS outcomes in the international human rights law framework to ensure that it was incredibly clear and accurate about the obligations of governments. And we're really pleased to see, as Paul mentioned, the particular role for the OHCHR and the human rights system that has been carved out. While there are also areas that we feel it's fallen short, we're very happy with that. A second goal, of course, was to maintain the multi-stakeholder approach in internet governance, but also to roll that out and to try and operationalize it in digital governance processes. And within that, we wanted to see the strengthening and the renewal of the Internet Governance Forum. And then thirdly, to promote greater coherence in digital governance, because we saw the risk of fragmented digital governance processes and a proliferation of spaces, making it all the more difficult for crucial voices to be engaged. As well as this, GPD, we worked with a kind of broad cross-stakeholder community to deliver these statements about the process and how we felt that should look and how it could embody principles of multi-stakeholderism. And I think that I want to just reflect briefly, because we've talked a lot about the outcomes, and while they're all somewhat yet to be determined, there are some promising signs. But in terms of the process, I think it's been a bright spot to see how this WSIS has experimented with quite a few innovative methods. So first of all, the informal multi-stakeholder sounding board is quite a novel thing in the UN system and has, I think, provided quite an effective bridge. And I do hope it will be tested in other processes. And then a second feature, which is something that we called for as the cross-stakeholder community in some of our statements, is the use of satellite consultations. So having the co-facilitators not just be in New York and not just be at the UN, but come to some of the spaces where our communities convene. So with that, they came to ICANN, they came to the global IGF in Norway, and we found that to be quite useful. And I think that's just maybe a brief point, because we have more to cover, but I think it's already been said, but I think the co-facilitators themselves showed a lot of kind of ambition and conviction to do that and to ensure a more open process. But I also think our community did quite a lot to position ourselves as a resource for them to show how this work can be done. And of course, natural that this community would be able to do that due to its history. Yeah.
Thank you very much. A lot of that echoes my own personal experiences as part of the TCCM, the Technical Community Coalition. We had a private briefing with the ambassador for Kenya, one of the co-facilitators. Incredibly impressive that he puts the time and effort into coming out into the community and meeting people and taking on board everything. It's a diplomatic process ultimately between governments, but it's chalk and cheese between, I think, previous experiences we've had where there have been treaty obligations and treaty negotiations that we've felt really part of the process, even if we're not completely happy with all of the way that the outcomes and compromises are achieved in the document. At least I think we feel given a good listening to as part of that process, and that makes a big difference, because David has to read all of the consultation inputs. It takes a lot of time to draft those things and to read them, and it felt in previous experiences as though you're sending things off into a black hole and you don't get any feedback. You don't know whether anyone's read it or taken any note of it or thinks it's a load of rubbish or thinks it's brilliant. And that's been very different, I think, in terms of the two-way dialogue. So we have got, by my calculation, just under 10 minutes for a more broad discussion. I'd like to open up for the floor if anybody wants to raise any questions. I can see Mr. Peake, I can see Mr. Golding, and Yus. So let's go in that order, right to left. I'll repeat the question just because I know some of the people online have had difficulty to hear it with the roving mics. Adam first, gentleman over there, table number 7.
Yeah, Adam Peake, thank you. Good to see you, Paul. Hope you have a good day in New York. Thank you, Nick. Your point about the co-facilitators is very well made, and they have been exceptional, and that has been a very important part of this process. In 2003, 2005, we had much more multi-stakeholder collaboration. We were in the room at the time of the process that Paul is involved with now. Civil society, private sector were commenting on the square bracketed text. The co-facilitators have done a great deal to balance that out. And so a question, do you think we will be able to see the sounding board process implemented in future United Nations discussions? Possibly a revised UNGIS process or any of the future processes ongoing. And we should also mention that Global Partners Digital were instrumental in kicking this idea of a Friends of co-facilitators process. So thank you, Ellie and team, also for doing that. But this has been a very useful part of the WSIS process to have that sounding board, to have co-facilitators who are willing to accept it. And could we anticipate it happening in the future?
So the question there from Adam was about the use of a novel-ish mechanism. So there's something, you've got to love the acronyms, the IMSB. This is the Informal Multi-Stakeholder Sounding Body, which the co-facilitators described it to me as their third co-facilitator to help reach out into other parts of the community outside of the UN General Assembly machinery. And I think knowing some of the people on that group, it's been a good thing. And the question which Adam asked was, is that going to be used more extensively in the future? And I think I'll ask Ellie, I think, because she's been most closely involved with some of that. I think it's been a good use. I suspect it depends on the subject matter, but it's been very successful here. So hopefully the people at the UN will be able to see that and be able to advocate for its further use as appropriate. I don't know if you've got anything further to add to that sort of.
We very much hope also that the new WSIS framework that evolves from this process can better embed multi-stakeholder principles. And I don't know where this particular piece of the text lies in terms of the negotiation, but there's a reference to UNGIS, one of the UN interagency coordination body that oversees a lot of the WSIS work, taking multi-stakeholder advice into its work. So we very much hoped that part was retained, but I understand it's quite a controversial, perhaps not particularly popular piece. So we hope to see that, and we very much hope to see it in future processes too. A reflection on the IMSB, it all happened at rapid speed, the establishment of this body, and by necessity, it selected itself from a particular pool of people, former MAG members, IGF, Multistakeholder Advisory Group members. And I think in the future, we'd want to think about a more kind of accountable, transparent, diverse way of selecting the membership of such a body. So just some quick thoughts.
Yeah, I think quite interesting. Obviously, there are certain, as David very articulately put it, there's different types of governments, and not everybody is like a liberal Western democracy. That's the minority in the UN system. And so the idea of actually reaching out to non-governmental or non-state agency participants is controversial, to say the least. Next question, I think from that table number 5, Rob Golding in the front with the green top.
Rob Golding. David mentioned that sometimes you can't go for what's best, you can't go for what's ideal, you have to go for what can get included. Is that only when that's non-government putting things forward for the documentation, or is that between governments? How much horse trading goes on in the room? And are there any examples of that you can give from earlier meetings, because you can't talk about the current one?
The question, just to repeat it for clarity, is around the sort of sausage-making process, which we have limited
the compromise
insight.
versus consensus.
There's a huge amount of political compromise between the nation states who are negotiating this. Everything is bargained and traded off, and every single word and positions of word. And if anybody is interested in this at all, it's actually worth looking at the changes. So if you look at the second revision, which came out last week, or was it the week before? Time's gone a bit strangely the last few weeks. But there's a red line between the first version and the second version, and you can see exactly the points of contention in the text. And that's been very good and helpful to have those sort of red lines, and it will continue through. The proof of the pudding will be in the final resolution, assuming that it does get through the procedures to pass as a UN resolution, which is not ever something to take for granted. Paul, you still with us? Was it?
Yeah, very good question. Yes, that kind of, when we talk about consensus, David was exactly right. That's between governments. Another phrase we use, which is that everyone is equally unhappy because no government gets exactly what they want, and we all have to live with things that we are not particularly keen on, but we have to do that in order to reach an agreement. We try to avoid horse trading, I think, like, we'll give you this if you give it less. Because I think, as much as possible, we do need to judge issues on their merits and not get into a sort of slightly cynical horse trading exercise. I think the way I've noticed how it works is that in many ways the most important stage is at the very beginning, when you are still shaping the agenda and scoping what are the issues that need to be addressed. And that's why we put so much emphasis into setting out our positive agenda, which really began a year ago, of what we think needs to be addressed. In many ways, the most important stage. Then, once that's been identified, the question is, what do you say about those issues? And sometimes there's consensus, sometimes it's a question of how much detail do we want to go into, how much specificity, and sometimes, as David said, it's about just finding some language which is vague enough that all countries can sign up to it. I think actually this process we've done rather well, and we do say some quite substantive things which will lead to some meaningful change. But yeah, in any intergovernmental process, there is always that trying to find a consensus that everyone is equally happy with.
Thank you very much for that answer, Paul. And that's a very good example of here. We have our government officials actually at the New York building telling us how it is. And I think that's exemplary. I think we've got time for just one last question.
Hi, thank you, Nick. Andrew Campling, for Paul's benefit. I was privileged to be at an EU-hosted briefing on the same topic this morning, You'll all be pleased to know that it was broadly consistent in the summation that was given, so there were no major areas of difference. A couple of quick points on a question. From that, though, there's still, although there's good news that there seems to be agreement on the permanent mandate for the IGF, there appears still to be a question about how it will be funded. So there's agreement in principle, but the thorny issue of funding, I think, matters a lot, and potentially the push for a government track within the IGF, which sounds a bit weird, because it's not as if governments don't get to talk at other places. But on the human rights question, which was touched on briefly, I think by David, there seemed to be a significant weakening of language around things like surveillance in the current text. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that and any other human rights related issues.
I think it's difficult for David to comment on it directly, but I'm sure Ellie will have a view on things like that.
Yes. Yeah, we have seen a deterioration of the human rights language compared with the zero draft, which we've been really disappointed by. I understand that some member states are still looking for ways in which to reintegrate, perhaps in some manner, some of the language, but it has been disappointing. We very much hope to, at the very least, retain the baseline that the Global Digital Compact gave us, the other policy agreement that David referred to, while recognizing that at the time that the Global Digital Compact was negotiated, we were in fact quite unhappy with some of its accuracy in respect to its evaluation of international human rights law obligations. So that's been disappointing. Similarly, there's currently a reference to internet shutdowns that might be of interest to people in this room. We'd hoped that it would take a bit of a fuller, more expansive view of network restrictions and restrictions on access. There used to be a reference to state-controlled internet architectures, which we found quite progressive and useful and built upon Global Digital Compact language, and we were disappointed that's been removed. So it's been insightful to hear how it's going, and I'm looking forward to hearing a bit more soon. Yeah.
Well, keep watching, everybody, because next week's the actual vote. So thank you very much to my excellent panelists, and thank you very much for Paul in New York. I was going to say that in comparison to some of the other topics today, it's rather a sort of a dry and Monty Python terms, that's something completely different. But actually, you talk about AI, transparency, responsibility, human rights protections, and the importance of the information society on everybody as citizens going forward. And it's a different lens, but it's a completely consistent line of thread with everything else that we've been talking about today. So big round of applause, please, for my participants, and thank you very much for the questions.